The CSS plugin is one of the more elaborate plugins for Codename One, and while it was developed by Steve Hanna, who is a Codename One employee, he developed it sort of as a separate, standalone personal hobby project, and it stayed that way until this moment specifically. Mostly because it's a very, very complex idea, and we're still not exactly sure how well it will fit into Codename One. It's something that we're evaluating whether to bring it into Codename One, maybe to build something a bit different, but so far it looks like it's gaining some traction and might become an official part of Codename One moving forward. But at this moment, no decision has been made. Regardless, it's still a very powerful tool, and because it's based on the existing Codename One capabilities, it should be supported forever in terms of the functionality. The working with CSS is very familiar, for better and for worse. I personally am not a big fan of CSS because of its overly obtuse syntax, but a lot of people are used to it and are familiar with it. And that can be good. It can also be sometimes bad, because for Codename One we need a lot of custom attributes, which aren't necessarily things that you can just use by copying and pasting from the internet. And that's another problem with CSS. You'd expect to be able to copy and paste CSS from the internet, which isn't exactly something you can fully do with this plugin, only to a partial extent. So to install the plugin, just go to the URL mentioned here. The npm installation process is the easiest if you have npm. If not, it might be more practical to just install it manually and maybe even base your installation on the project that I provided here with a test that includes the source code of everything, just copying the jars and everything. The usage is also explained in that website at the GitHub project. But I'll give you a couple of examples so you will have good context to begin with CSS. So a very basic Hello World CSS would be just creating a button. And in this case, you'll notice what I was referring to when I said custom Codename One attributes. Notice the CN1 pill border is a special case attribute, and there's a lot of documentation with a lot of these in the website. It's essentially the round border from Codename One. Only the CN1 round border is the round version, and the pill border is the version that's defined as rectangle in Codename One, rounded with rectangle. And here I define obviously the background color, foreground color, those are identical. And notice the special case for the font family, which is native main thin, which is the native thin fonts that are supported built in by Codename One. So that's again another special case in CSS here. But ultimately this is actually really, really nice, and it hides a lot of complexity because the button will be applied to the pressed and selected mode and will essentially just work as you pretty much expect. The only other change I need to make to the code is change the hi world to use a button instead of using a label by default. And once I do that, I get this, which is what I would expect to happen, and it worked the first time I tried it, which is really, really, really impressive in terms of this particular plugin. It works really well, and if you're comfortable with CSS, it's a very interesting approach. So what exactly happened here? Because I defined a theme. Do we still have a theme? How does it exactly work? If you understand the concepts of Codename One and the theme res file, well, I'll try to explain it in a bit more detail. So the CSS support uses a preprocessor that parses the CSS and generates a theme.res file, actually theme.css.res file by default. Technically, you can name it anything. If you name your CSS file x.css, it will call it x.css.res. But one of the things that you need to do is define layering. And layering essentially places the base theme.res and places the CSS theme on top of that. And that means when our init code loads, it loads the theme.res file initially and sets it as the theme for the application. And within that theme, we have a theme constant. I'm not sure if, I don't think I discussed the concept of theme constants before, but there's essentially a tab within the designer where you can when you can see constants that you can define to define all sorts of behaviors in codename 1. And one of them is an overlay where you can say, okay, in this theme, this is just the base. After you finish loading this theme, load these other themes. And essentially the theme.res file, at least when you use the npm install, adds another overlay theme and points to the CSS file created. And that way it's essentially loaded automatically for you, and you get the CSS in place. The nice thing about that is that you can still use the designer if you're more comfortable doing some things in the designer, and that's just changing stuff there in the theme, the default theme. And then go to the CSS and do the things that you're more comfortable doing there. So you have essentially two res files, and because of the way it's built, the CSS one will take precedence because it comes after the base theme. So if there's a conflict, the CSS always takes it in this case. You can flip that as well, but that would require a bit of code. That's generally it. Now, two things I can go on about CSS and the selectors. There's this remarkably huge list of attributes that Steve implemented there, and obviously going even over a fraction of them. It includes support for 9-piece borders and other capabilities of codename 1. But I don't want to dig into all of that because it's a bottomless pit of subjects. The two things I would like to touch is images and basic selectors. So I'm giving here two examples of how you can customize various behaviors. And one of those is the button pressed. I can just do that, and essentially this is a bit of a darker color now. The next image won't show that because it shows the regular button, but if you'd press it, it would have the darker color. And that's all I need. I don't need to define all the other things. I don't need to define the border again. I don't need to define anything. It will just work, and that's pretty nice in its own right. There's no need to do any extra work or anything like that. It just works with the darker color. And by the way, part of that is also one of the nice things about that is that it uses the round border. In the past, the CSS plugin had support for round borders, but it used an image, and that was inferior in some regards because it would deteriorate with the various resolutions. In this case, the round border sort of solves that problem and allows us to create very compelling user interface elements. And you'll notice I have another selector here for a form, and in it I place an image reference. Now the nice thing about it is that I created a directory images under the CSS directory and placed duke.png there, which is a standard image of Duke. But one of the nice things about that is that you can put any URL. You can put a URL off the internet, literally an HTTP URL, and it will work. It will get in there and The next thing that might not be intuitive is the source DPI value. Normally an image would just be included, but once we include that attribute, it automatically assumes that the image is a multi-image, and it will import it as a multi-image and automatically scale it to the various resolutions as needed. And that's really, really nice because it allows you to add multi-images with essentially no real work. There's other ways that the CSS plugin allows you to import multi-images, including including all of the various resolutions and all sorts of other approaches. It's really nice. And in this case, I gave a 260 ppi resolution, or DPI resolution, which essentially is close to very high in terms of the resolutions. So the image would be scaled, and that indicates the size of the source image. So if the resolution is very high, it will just use the source image as is. If it's trying to create a high resolution image, it will scale it down by a specific factor that determines the difference between high and very high. I can go into the semantics, but generally, if an image matches was designed, for instance, for an iPhone, iPhone 5, so it has DPI of 400, I think, or 360. Then you define that version, that size of the DPI here, and the scaling algorithm will automatically scale it to the right resolutions. Don't catch me on my word about the DPI of iPhones. I don't remember it by heart at 1 a.m. Anyway, the background type essentially says we want to align the image to the bottom right, and that's again codename 1 style, specific style in CSS. You can do anything. You can tile, all of the things that you can do in the designer, you can do through the CSS here. And that's really nice. And this essentially places Duke at the bottom right corner of the form like this. And I can't press the hi world here because it's an image, but it would change the color based on that. So I hope this brief presentation helped explain CSS. I think there's huge potential there, and I hope you enjoy working with it. Thank you.